Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Julie Dunn, who is in the School of Education at Griffith. I'm not going to read Julie's biography either, because we're here to listen to Julie today. But I just want to highlight that one of the great strengths that Julie has is that her work spans research and scholarship in early childhood, right through primary, secondary, and beyond, working with adults, including those with dementia. But there's a really strong connection all the way between playfulness, artful play, the importance of drama and applied theatre across all of her writing and research. And so, Julie, welcome. We're very much looking forward to hearing you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And I'm coming to you today from sunny Queensland. It's a beautiful day here, and I live in Manly in Brisbane, and I'm coming in from home, which is, for those of you who don't know Brisbane terribly well, Manly is a suburb right on the edge of Moreton Bay, overlooking the fantastic Stradbroke and Moreton Island, which is Quandamooka land. And important to note that there's been evidence of First Nations peoples living on Stradbroke Island for 20,000 years. So it's important to acknowledge those lands that we have the very good fortune to now share. Okay, so here we are. All right, so today we're going to be focused on, and I'm getting all kinds of messages on my screen, and we're going to be focused on the relationship between agency, playfulness and creativity in education and beyond. That's quite a lot to cover in 30 or 40 minutes, so I'll do my best. I think it's important that this kind of links very well with Yong's presentation previously, because he placed a very significant emphasis on agency, and I'm going to be doing similarly, as I kind of feel like agency is the key that that holds this together for all of it. So I'm going to be particularly drawing on some quite old literature today, mainly because playfulness is not really all that popular. The trouble with playfulness, it's a bit like play. Creativity seems to be the poster child, but playfulness seems to be the one that's forgotten. It's perhaps too frivolous. It's altogether too much fun. It's not part of what we need in our education systems, or indeed in our health systems, or in business. So playfulness is kind of has not been as well spotlighted as I believe it should be. And I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time differentiating today between play and playfulness, because for me they're very, very, very different. We're going to be talking a bit about that in a further on. So as Robin said, I've spent the last 25 years as a play researcher, working with early childhood children right through to people living with advanced stage dementia. And it was quite a privilege to have the opportunity to work alongside artists and to be playfully engaging with people at the end of their life. And it was very different when people say people with dementia, they're just like young children. That's the most insulting thing I think I can ever hear, because those people have this massive life experience. They've been highly skilled professionals in their own way. They've raised children. They've been parents, and they're not at all like young children. So the playfulness that I'm talking about here, I'm not conflating that. I think it's important to say. So I'm also going to be drawing on my experience as an educator, as a parent, and as a researcher. So I hope you find that useful. So I'm going to argue today that I think playfulness might be the missing link in creativity discourses. And I'm going to be suggesting that if we look at playfulness really in depth, we're going to discover some things that can be really useful in both teaching for creativity and teaching creatively. So I want to look, first of all, at some definitions of playfulness, because I think it's really important that we get kind of a grounding of what I actually mean by playfulness before we move on to kind of share what is the kind of the heart of what I want to talk about today. Csikszentmihalyi has suggested that anything can be done in a playful manner. Look at this, 1981, his work back then. And he says, whilst basketball players might toil in a game, they may never experience playfulness at all. So I think the same could be said about my golf. I often, when I'm playing golf, I'm playing, but there's not much playfulness. In fact, there's not much joy, not much manifest joy or humor or anything. I'm just bashing that ball around the course as best I can. So we can have play without playfulness. I love Sutton Smith. If you haven't dug into Brian Sutton Smith, that great play researcher from New Zealand, he talks about playfulness as being disruptive of settled expectations. And so that's the important thing about playfulness for me, is that it gives us the opportunity to unsettle the expectations of the ways we would normally go about something. And for me, that's why it's such a perfect match in terms of creativity, because it gives us the opportunity to disrupt the way in which we would normally go about things. Now, Lieberman's work is really important because she was way back in 1977, one of the first people to kind of explore the relationship between playfulness, imagination, and creativity. And, you know, her work's been used and tested, and she's used measures to kind of, she's got a playfulness scale, which Barnett then took on board. And there's been a lot of kind of sort of scientific research in the psychology field in particular around playfulness scales. I'm not a fan of those kinds of scales, but I am interested in her definition of playfulness, which that is, it's social, physical, and cognitive spontaneity, manifest joy, and she includes within that pleasure in the spontaneity. So it doesn't have to be hilariously funny. We're not rolling around the floor. It's not that kind of manifest joy for playfulness, but it's this sense of pleasure in the spontaneity of our thinking and the thinking of others. And a sense of humor, which once again isn't about telling jokes, but it's this sense of humor that allows us to contribute imaginatively to processes that result in creative products, she says, but I would also argue processes. Now, the important thing about Lieberman's definition, which at first I challenged, and she said, well, you've got to get rid, it's got to be differentiated from impulsive or disruptive behavior. Now, I was quite okay when I was doing my PhD 20 years ago with the, yes, let's get rid of disruptive behavior, because in fact, what disruptive behavior is doing is preventing us from playing, from being playful. So disruptive behavior that takes us outside of the focus that we're working in, and I don't mean that narrowly, I'm going to open that up, but someone who's just intentionally disrupting in a way that's disrupting of the focus of the playfulness. So that needs to be kind of set aside. Impulsive, I guess what she means is spontaneous rather than impulsive. And it's to do, I think, with when we get in a moment, we start talking about discipline and domain knowledge in playfulness. It's to do with that. It's that the impulsive is less important than the spontaneous. So quite a bit to think about there. So more recent work by Bateson and Martin, and interesting, I must find out if Bateson is related to Gregory Bateson, who's a great play researcher. But Bateson and Martin have recently, relatively recently, because there's not a lot in this territory, looked at playfulness, play, creativity, and innovation. And for them, they argue that playful behaviour and playful thought can generate radically new approaches to challenges set by the social and physical environment. So for them, playfulness is what we as humans need to do, that we can exploit this aspect of our way of thinking to foster creativity and innovation. And they would argue that, that through playfulness, we can generate novel patterns of thought. And for me, that's what creativity is all about. It's actually creating those novel patterns of thought. And that the good thing about play, and they call it playfulness, they have a particular category called playful play, which I'm not sure I agree with. But anyway, they say that it's accompanied by a positive mood state. So I guess one of the things about playfulness and play itself is that you can never make anyone play. Just like I don't think you can ever make anyone be creative. You have to want to play. You have to want to engage in playful thought. You have to, that's the motivation, is coming from the task itself. It's a way of thinking. So I think the mood state comes from the fact that you're willingly engaging in this process, which is going to be important in a minute when we talk about education context. So this diagram here, which is from Bateson and Martin, by the way, their work stems from working with animals, and they've kind of, they're biologists who've looked at a lot of playful animals and how that actually links to how animals solve problems, which is very interesting. If you, the book, the reference is there, Play, Playfulness, Creativity and Innovation. So how do animals solve problems? And they've kind of identified that the more playful animals seem to be the ones that have been best at solving the problems in their environment. And interestingly, I think I want to argue that playfulness has certain conditions. So one of the main things I'm going to be talking about today is that agency is a precondition for playfulness, and that playfulness works best when it has some conditions attached to it, that it's domain and disciplined informed, that it's focused playfulness, that it's supported, and that it's not overly or strictly limited by time or specificity. So if we want children or adults or, you know, health workers or businesses to give their staff members or learners or whatever opportunities to be playful, then we've got to be not so strictly limited by time or specificity, but more about that later. And so if we have agency and the playfulness is characterized in this way, my argument is that creative outcomes, both of an individual and a collaborative nature, may become evident, but not immediately. And that's an important point. So let's turn first of all to agency. And I think it's interesting, some interesting work by Erikson way back, where Erikson claimed that Einstein's scientific creativity was nurtured at least in part by the autonomy which his family provided for him. And in fact, his inventiveness, in scientific inventiveness, developed mostly in spite of the education that he was given. So it's really interesting that listening to Yong speak about the importance of, you know, individualizing education and giving children, making sure that children have agency, that's the cornerstone of my argument here today as well, that we need to consider the learner as an agentic actor. And this definition of agency comes from some work that we did for the Queensland Government over 2 years on the characteristic of effective pedagogies in the early years. And we came up with 11 characteristics for effective pedagogies. One of them is playfulness, one of them is agency. So you can see that this has been kind of stewing for me for some time. So interestingly though, for me, is that, and this came up earlier in the presentation when Yvette offered the comment that when children go to school, when children are in the early childhood years before they go to formal schooling, they have masses of amounts of agency, and it's only once once they move into formal schooling that a lot of that agency is lost. So I just want to share with you this short sort of 3-minute video that we made for a project called 200 Children's Voices. And I think if we're talking about children and we're talking about children having agency, we should listen to what they've got to say. So this is just a little clip of some kindergarten children sharing how they like to learn. And I want you to have a look while you're watching it, to be on the lookout for their opportunities to exercise agency and how that agency has flowed into their creativity. Hopefully this works.
"200 Children's Voices."
Is that big enough to see?
Kindergarten.
So remember, in Queensland kindergarten are 3-year-olds.
I like to learn.
We sit down upstairs and look at a book, and then we read the stories. And if we can't read, we get at the pictures. And we also play games up here. We need to learn about the colours. That red, my favourite pink. Yay. I maybe learned about everything in the class. In the block area, I just saw some houses and some buildings. So something not really high or the fall over because it's too high. I can try dress up so I can be aerial movement. So it feels like I'm a movement. I don't need any help, I can put on myself. They make me get some ideas. I can make hot chocolate. Needed to get the hot chocolate out of here. It's not real needle, it's just
Other places I like to learn.
outside, the sandpit and the monkey bars. Making area. Making boxes and tape. This isn't here. Stairs.
Ways I like to learn.
I made things and made the castle out of a good box. This is what the box I made the castle out of. That's what that box was. And put a flower in it. Just make it look a little good. Well, that box gave me that idea. Yeah, because it looked like a castle was waiting to be made on it. The castle is what I was very, very proud of. It looked beautiful. To just work as a team because you have to plan what you're gonna make in your head, and it takes lots of hard work. This is the thing we made last week. It's a car wash. They put in a big box, and this is a big box, and it takes lots of work.
People who help me learn.
Mum told me. One my friend, like Saskia, Billy, I just listen to Mummy and Daddy reading it to me. The teacher will just tell me. I just copy my sister's reading.
Things I like to do.
And what I mostly like swinging is because I can almost touch the roof. I like to read books. And get to messy. Then what the teacher say.
And pretending.
We're being aliens in spaceships. So the cheese is the spaceship, and that the tunnel is where we get into the spaceship. We're aliens, and the children can't eat our alien faces. Yes, we do.
Chicken alert, indeed. So I always show this to my secondary students and I say to them, what do you think? And they bury their heads and say, what's going on? All these very young children, 3.5, have all this agency, have all this power over their learning, have all this control. And yet by the time they get to us in secondary school, we have so constrained them. You know, one of my favorite lines in that is the little girl saying that she built the castle because the box was waiting for a castle to be made on it. She wasn't waiting for a teacher to say, let's go and find a box to make a castle. She saw the box, she made the castle. So, and you know, the boy that made the garage, the children playing Chicken Alert, Aliens, they've got so much agency, so much playfulness, and obviously there's opportunities for them to engage in creative thinking and creative processes. So I think that's kind of really important for me. And another example is just last week, I was invited to play with some children who are family friends. And the children, just the agency they had in the play gave them the chance to, some of them we were playing flying carpet travel agencies, and the boys decided they were going to make mobile phones and computers and so on, and they got to choose. It wasn't choice. So I think it's important to note that choice is different to agency. I didn't say you can either do this or this. They just took off and did it. So they playfully engaged with the materials that were on hand. And I like that Yong talked about teachers as being curators of resources. It was important that I was there with some resources on hand so that they could be playful, so as curators of resources. But one of the other children, she had a very different idea of how she wanted to engage playfully. She engaged by spending all of her time deciding what she was going to wear to be the receptionist at the travel agent and to also fly the magic carpet. So these children give us a good sense of, you know, how young children just dive straight in and not only are willing to come up with their own ideas, but demand it. And somewhere along the way in education, we lose that. This image is from the Playful Engagement, the Dementia project. And once again, agency was really important in that project because the elderly folk we engaged with had 100% right at any time to say, no, I don't want to engage today, I'm not interested. Their level of engagement, their level of commitment to the work. This is Annie Yen and Clark Crystal, who are Tiny and Dumpling, and they're engaging playfully. Just so you know, the Playful Engagement project was pairing of relational clowns. It wasn't a performance, absolutely not. Individual visits where the artist applied a range of playful vocabularies to engage individuals, drawing on their social biographies, environmental cues in their room, and their own artist's intuition. So the playfulness there came from their ability as artists to both ensure that the individual had the chance to exercise agency, and then their skill at applying a range of playful vocabularies, which resulted in some very beautiful work that came from that project. So let's have a look at playfulness itself then. We've looked at agency and how important that is, but let's look at the playfulness itself and these notions of domain or discipline-informed playfulness, supported, focused, and about the limitations. I'm sorry. So this next slide for me is probably the most important in the whole presentation, because Blattner and Blattner offer the example of playfulness to suggest that it's domain informed. And they offer the example that you can't playfully ride a bike until you can already ride a bike. So if you think about when you were learning to ride a bike, you were so terrified that you were going to fall off, that there was no chance that you were going to be playful with that. But once you've mastered the riding of a bike, then you can be playful. So you know how to ride, so you can then take one hand off. You can take one foot off the pedal. You can, you know, take what this gentleman is doing here. I think it's the most ridiculous example of playful engagement with a push bike. He's actually riding backwards down a fjord in Norway in the rain, doing 80 kilometers an hour. So his playfulness is informed by mastery or domain knowledge. He knows how to ride a bike at a very high level. Just like the children the examples I gave before of the children in the magic carpet office, they knew how to create a play space. They know how to play. They know how to meta-communicate their ideas. They know how to improvise. They understand that they need props, they need a place, they need space, and so on. They actually have the domain knowledge that enables the playfulness. So rather than playfulness being viewed as a free-for-all where people just kind of randomly throw ideas in, it's really important that we kind of, for me, understand that playfulness is actually domain informed. So if you think about a simple task like wiping up. I don't know about you as a child, but in my house when I was a child, we always playfully wiped up because we hated doing it. So we were flicking suds and flicking towels, but we actually knew how to properly wipe up. And that enabled us to be able to playfully engage with the process of wiping up. So I would argue that in schools and classrooms, what we need to remember is that that creativity is built on opportunities to engage playfully, but with domain knowledge. So that domain knowledge might be about science. Certainly Einstein couldn't explore science playfully if he didn't already have domain knowledge. And I would also argue that one of those domains of knowledge is knowledge about creativity itself. So for our kids to know about how creativity happens as is one of those domains of knowledge. And we also bring multiple domains of knowledge together. So it's a transdisciplinary playfulness, I guess you could argue, because the playfulness occurs not just with knowing how to play, but if we think about those children that were playing the Flying Carpet Travel Agency, they were also bringing to bear their knowledge of how a travel agency works, what you need in an office. They were also bringing to bear their knowledge of flying carpets. So they were bringing together a whole lot of domains of knowledge that enable them to be playful. So playfulness is not a free-for-all, but it goes back to some of those definitions of playfulness we talked about before. It's being disruptive of settled expectations. So the settled expectations of riding a bike, the settled expectations of an office was completely disrupted by the playfulness of it being a flying carpet travel agency rather than a normal travel agency. So they're very important for me. So this next one is supported. So the second characteristic is that the playfulness for me needs to be supported. And for me, the playfulness is probably best supported by peers, by the children's own peers, or by, if you're in a business, by working with the others in your business and so on. So the playfulness is best supported by peers. But if your peers aren't great and don't have the domain knowledge that you need, don't have the playfulness, then you need someone more able in that or other allied domains. So here's me engaging with a group of children, and I'm playfully engaging with them around learning language. These are beginning language learners, and I'm in role as a robot, and I'm developing their language skills. So what domain knowledge do I have? I have knowledge of language, I have domain knowledge of education, but I also have domain knowledge of playfulness. I know how to play. I'm a really competent player. So I'm a more able other, which doesn't necessarily mean that educators are always the best people to be co-players or to engage playfully with others. It may be artists or parents, or if you're in a science context, the more able other might be a scientist who can bring that domain knowledge in to support the play. And I think it's really important that we have that sense of understanding that the support doesn't necessarily have to come from the teacher, but that support in the playfulness can come from any number of sources. So, for example, here I am playfully engaging in a drama education class. I'm a really good player. I think I'm a really good player. So I have domain knowledge and play, and you can see the pleasure in the children's faces as they're looking at me. I'm actually in role as a really naughty little girl who's kidnapped a small person, and the children there are from the Council of the Little People who are trying to get their citizen back. And so there's lots of joy and pleasure going on in our playfulness, but I'm supporting them through my knowledge of how to play and engage in drama. But just to remind us that playfulness can also be highly serious, these are the children taken from another angle later on, where they're trying to decide, should that naughty girl, that's me standing on the chair, be given a wish or not? And they're carefully thinking about it. So they're trying to make a decision. So playfulness can be really serious as well. It doesn't have to be like we often see as frivolous. So here's some playfulness at work in a media arts classroom where the young people have been supported in a project that we engaged in called Y Connect. Secondary students supported to be playful in their video making, their media making. And who were they supported by? Yes, their teachers, but by media artists who kind of pushed them to explore things in slightly different ways to what they'd been doing before, to engage playfully in a supportive environment that was domain informed. So that domain informed knowledge is really important. The students had some, their peers had some, but they were in a class where they really weren't pushing the boundaries in terms of their creative productions in media. And so having an artist there to work alongside of them was to add some domain knowledge, to build on what they already had, and also to give them the permission that they needed to make sure that they were playful. Here's one from the same project, and it's in a maths classroom. And here we have a dancer, Liesl Zink, engaging with some young people in that Y Connect project, playfully in the mathematics classroom, exploring mathematical concepts in a really playful way. She's got the domain knowledge of the body. She's able to support them. She's playful. And the students are then have the opportunity to develop their ideas mathematically, but also to be very creative in the way that they explore mathematical concepts and build new domain knowledge. And here we have an artist working with kids in a physical clowning unit within a drama class. And there's the teacher playfully engaging with the young people and demonstrating her playfulness as she works with the young people and the teacher. And that's again Anna Yen, who worked on the project. So the next thing I want to talk about is focused, that the playfulness needs to be focused, but not too tightly focused. And I think one of the things, if we're going to collaborate, we're going to invite young people to collaborate, we can't have ultimate autonomy. So whilst agency is important, sometimes it is important that the opportunities for playfulness are not so broad that everybody's doing something different, and then that kind of hinders collaboration, but are open enough so that everyone can engage in a way that's going to work for them, but not so broad that it's kind of everyone in the room's doing something different. And I think that this, one of the big barriers to focused but not too tightly is assessment. So in much of our education, we're so driven by what's the task for the end of the learning experience, that what then tends to happen is we may offer playful experiences for children or young people in classrooms, but then what gets layered on top of that is the assessment task, which everyone has to do the same. So everyone has to report on their exploration in the same way. And I think there's some amazing like maker spaces go on in classrooms, but what tends to then make that focus too tight is when the assessment task then becomes the same for everybody. And then that means that you really can't be too playful because you've always got to return back to that focused assessment task. So sure, if we're going to, I was talking to a teacher the other day and she said they were doing this wonderfully playful stuff about designing animals that were like half pelican, half crocodile, and thinking about their environments, and then thinking playfully with language and calling them pelidiles and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, they all had to write a written report to report on what they'd done in their explorations. So that kind of, for me, crushes the chance for a creative solution or some way of sharing creatively the creative processes that they've engaged with through their playful exploration. And finally, not too constrained by time or specificity. That playfulness is really, as I said before, you can't make anyone play, and neither can you make individuals play to a timeline. The timeline will really constrain the engagement. So we need to think about how we can make the playtime more flexible? How do we give the opportunity for children and young people to explore those focused areas of exploration, but to do it in a way that is not too constrained by time? So Taylor and Rogers and Kaiser say, for a child to develop a playful disposition, they need ample opportunities to exhibit it, and they need to have it modelled for them. So that's really important. It's the opportunities, and they need to be ample, and they need to be not too strongly constrained by time, I think. So I just want to finish by this, just even to say that in the Playful Engagement Project, we didn't predetermine the time that the artist spent with the elderly folk. Some of the visits went for a minute, and some of them went for nearly an hour. The time was relevant to the kind of playfulness that was going on, and whether that playfulness was creating what we've now called in our more recent papers, quality moments of life. We started on this project exploring how we could create quality of life, and decided at the end of the day that we couldn't, not measured in any kind of scientific way at least, but what we could do through playful engagement was to create some quality moments of life. And interestingly, those same researchers I just spoke about before, Taylor, Rogers and Kaiser, say the ability to be playful may be one of the most important predictors of quality of life for children. So I think if we can create some quality moments in the life of our learners, and that leads to creativity, then that's what we probably should be aiming for as educators. So just to recap, agency is the foundation stone. Playfulness has these 4 kind of ideal characteristics, and especially in a classroom context, and that if we can get that right, then we can be working very strongly towards creative outcomes and processes. And I have some references there if anyone is interested in those. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That was truly wonderful. And I think your point about playfulness as being a missing link, and so often, not identified as important in thinking about creativity, is really salient for all of us. Now, we have some very interesting questions. Unfortunately, we're going to be constrained a bit by time. But Virginia, I wondered if you'd like to ask your question about assessment in the first instance. You'll have to unmute.
Great. Sorry about that. The question of assessments in Yong's presentation and yours, which was wonderful, thank you, Julie, is assessment, and it's so big. How do you envisage reimagining assessment to enable more playfulness and agency in classrooms? And do you agree with Yong, who states, which is so wonderful, like music to the ears, that we shouldn't worry so much about assessment?
I guess for me, it's about what you call assessment and how you designate assessment. And so for me, I think one of the problems we've had in education is that we tend to conflate assessment with an assessment task. And I think if we saw assessment as being more evidence gathering rather than task focused, we'd get a better sense of what our learners know and can do. And then we wouldn't be so reliant on this endpoint task. So I always use with my students, I tell them that they need to be like CSI investigators who don't just come into a crime scene and rely on the shoe that they find and say, oh, this is Julie Dunn's shoe, she must have committed the crime. They gather multiple sources of evidence, and we can be gathering evidence while the kids are playfully engaging with tasks. We can be looking at the kinds of things that they're creating, we can be examining that. But if we rely on this endpoint summative task, forget the benchmark, national testing. I kind of think that's that's always going to be hanging over our heads. But if we can shift practice in the classroom, including in secondary schools, so that we're not so reliant on assessment as the task and more reliant on assessment as an evidence gathering process, then everything counts. Every minute of every day is an opportunity to gather evidence and to assess students in informal ways through checklists, anecdotal records, note-taking, filming, videoing, and so on. I mean, for me as a parent, I'd much rather see my child playfully engaged in collecting an evidence of them showing their creativity in that way. Rachel might feel differently. She's the assessment expert here, but yeah, that's my viewpoint.
Thank you.
And Rachel has a question, Julie, that takes us in a little bit of a different direction.
Oh, thank you. And I don't know if that was for me, but
it was, Rachel.
Okay, I am 100% that assessment should mirror what students do. So yes, I agree. This is a little bit to the side, and Julie, that was just wonderful, and it was really nourishing. So thank you so much. That was just fantastic. I've become really interested in my personal life in playful activism, which is related to arts activism, but it is quite different. And I felt so much synergy with what you were saying, the principles of playfulness in education, how those apply to activism. And it's only through choice and agency, I think, that activism becomes effective. I think our secondary students in particular are showing unbelievable amounts of playfulness in their activism, their climate activism particularly. And even though it's outside the classroom, outside the formal classroom, do you think this is a kind of playfulness in education? And I think the second thing is, do you think that any of those principles can apply? I personally think they do, except for one. I see more experienced activists saying, no, you can't do it playfully. And it's almost the opposite of what we were talking about, that the expertise of riding a bike, you have to be, once you are so expert, I find that really kills the playfulness in activism. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, there's a lot going on there. Look, I think if we go back to this notion that people see playfulness as being non-serious, and so that's one of the problems, whether it's in activism or in the classroom, is that we conflate playfulness as being non-serious. And in fact, that's why I love Sutton Smith's notion of kind of pushing back against expectations. So our expectations are that children will stay in the classroom and they won't go out on the street and protest. So that's in a way what makes it playful, because but it's deadly serious. So those children sitting looking very sternly at trying to decide, they were deadly serious, but they also were being playful because they knew that they weren't little people, and they knew that I hadn't kidnapped a little person and put them in a glass jar. So I think sometimes when people say, oh, we shouldn't be playful, we should be deadly serious, it's because they don't understand what playfulness is. And I think it's about pushing back into settled expectations, and that's where creativity comes from. And I think if we think about some of the movements that have worked really well in activism, they've been highly creative movements. And I think they're going to be more successful if they're more creative. And therefore they need the playfulness to make them more creative. So if they're just kind of blunt instruments, then they're not going to work so well as something that's really unique, creative, and playful. So I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Rachel. Great question. Have we time for one more question, Thomas? Yes, just one, sadly. Costa, you have a question. Perhaps I'll ask it in the interest of time. Is the relationship between creativity and agency like chicken and egg? Do you find in your experience one leads to the other? And vice versa, I guess.
No, I definitely don't think it's chicken and egg. I don't think that creativity leads to agency. I actually think that it is an absolute prerequisite for creativity. If learners don't have agency in their lives, if schools completely dominate their time, if parents make sure that their children are busy all of the time, involve swimming Monday, tennis Tuesday, drama Wednesday, then the children have no agency, and they are unlikely then to be able to engage in the kind of playfulness that takes time. It does take time. You know, that play I did with the flying travel agency with those kids, we spent from 8:30 in the morning, we were still playing at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they did not let up. They were on school holidays. There was absolutely no stopping them. They were immersed in it. They were, you know, Chicks Mahai's notion of flow. They were playfully engaging with each other and with me. I was supporting them, sure, but their creativity was enabled through the playfulness and the agency, not the other way around. So no, I don't think it's a chicken and egg at all. I think it's all egg. I don't know what that means, but yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. Yeah. So agency, absolutely, and I think that's what Yong was saying too. Is, you know, schools are kind of so constraining of everybody doing the same thing. But so my presentation today was more, I guess it's, Yong's is kind of the radical transformation. I'm just kind of wanting to argue for, you know, opportunities for children to exercise agency and to be allowed to explore playfully with each other, with the support. And I kind of want to make a plug for this, that it's not always the teacher who's the best person to offer the support. That, you know, like in the school drama project, like in Y Connect, the artists are there, and, you know, artists are really playful people, so they're fantastic in supporting playfulness. But scientists, I know, are really playful too. So let's get some scientists into the science classroom to engage playfully with children and let them get away from the, you know, must write down the processes. You know, I don't think Einstein followed the genre approach when he was doing his scientific investigation. So I think we just need to let loose and make science be more playful. Let history be more playful, heaven forbid. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for an absolutely fabulous presentation.
Thanks, Robin.